You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead. I'm the president and a portfolio manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers and book junkies. It can be said that leaders are readers, and we believe books provide us a great source of information for filtering what is and isn't important for us as investors. Investing is the last great liberal art and the best way to spend a lifetime of learning. This podcast is for readers, thinkers, business-minded people, and investors who want to grow their knowledge from great authors and their writing. Charlie Munger often talks about using multiple mental models and analysis. Our aim for this podcast is to help listeners test Munger's theory in business, markets, and people. Investors and people we run into and meet often ask us what books are on our reading list. This is our quarterly episode to talk about books, and more books. Joining me to talk about our reading list is our Chief Investment Officer, my dad, Bill Smead. Also joining Bill and me for the first time is our colleague and senior analyst, Seamus Sullivan. Bill and Seamus, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks, Cole. Great to be with you.
So I'm excited to talk about, what we're reading, going over anything we've read, and also, things that are out there, that we've been told about for books. So I'll pass to Bill first. Can you go through some books that you've recently read?
Yeah, I read The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio, and we're big on economic history and trying to find other time periods that had analogous situations, and he did really a great job of covering the emergence of the Dutch economy being a powerhouse, the British being a powerhouse, and then asking the question, is the United States going to go the way of those prior powerhouses? Read, of course, The Economics of the Parables by Father Robert Sirico. The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and Munger says always invert, and in effect that's exactly what C.S. Lewis did. He wrote a book of how to find virtue by inverting it and talking about the way that Satan might want to ruin you, and therefore it's brilliant. And then All About Me by Mel Brooks, who's absolutely one of my favorite creators of entertainment through TV writing, script writing, making movies, and just absolutely entertaining my life.
Yeah, so for me, obviously we all read, the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. To your point, Bill, it's written from the picture of a demon advising another demon on their patient, and it's interesting to think about because, I think Seamus and I were talking about this morning. When we're analyzing a business, there's sometimes where you want to figure out what can kill it, right? In other words, you might not actually want to figure out how it succeeds. You might want to figure out how you could kill it. Back to the kind of Munger's inversion theory. But I point that out because effectively the demon and his consultant, Screwtape and Wormwood, are trying to figure out how to damage the patient to the highest degree. And what's interesting is, they'll get to points where they couldn't damage them like they were hoping they could. And he would be excoriating.
And Lewis had massive credibility in the academic world as well as in the faith world. Churchill asked him to speak to the British people while they're getting bombed by Germany in World War II. And so he had massive credibility with all sources. And so reading this book and him inverting, I thought was just a brilliant way to allow someone that maybe hadn't grown up in a faith world to understand the practical world.
Yeah, the other, so Bill, I'm going to ask you to tell a little story because you read All About Me by Mel Brooks, Mel Brooks is 96 years old. He's been an incredibly successful person to be a kid from New York to do that. I haven't read his book, but I'm looking forward to reading that. Do you want to tell your Mel Brooks story from your Drexel days? Just as a picture of how funny he is, period.
So in the Smead family, we like to give out nicknames to people we like. And a lot of times someone's nickname will be based on the TV, movie personality or famous person that they look like. And so my wife and I got in the habit of doing that a lot. And so a Friday afternoon, we had a date night. This is when Cole was a little guy, and we had 5 kids. And so we had a date night. And so she came down to the office. Well, what she didn't know, I was at Oppenheimer at the time, and Mel Brooks was taking his production company public through Oppenheimer and was in Seattle for that segment of the road show. And he was wandering around the office, and I stepped out of my office, invited him in, and told him how much of a blessing that his work was to me, and how much I loved Blazing Saddles and all the other great Spaceballs, and just all the other ones that he had done. So my wife, Cole's mom, comes wandering in, and I said, honey, I'd like you to meet Mel Brooks. Well, of course, Becky thought he was a guy that I knew in the industry or from the office that looks like Mel Brooks, and didn't realize that it was Mel Brooks. And we laugh about that to this day.
I was just watching a movie, and obviously he's done an incredible number of kids voiceovers the last 10 years, as he's got older. And my kids were shocked to find out how many movies he is, either scripting or doing the voiceover for. So let's see. So the books that I've just got done reading. I just read The Chancellors by Howard Davies. Howard, who's actually currently the chairman of NatWest Group, the former RBS bank, is going to be coming on the podcast to talk about that book. Coming from the United States, where we look at the central bank, the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell and the various governors, and then the Treasury Department, we think of them as being very distinctly different entities. In the UK, for much of its history, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Bank of England were much more tied together. So it's interesting to think about different structures. Also, he highlights things like the inflation target. We have a dual mandate policy here, which is labor and obviously inflation, and it's inflation not to be greater than 2%. Well, in the Bank of England, for example, thinking about their financial structure, theirs is plus or minus 2%, which is a vastly different mandate, because you might go to 1.5, you might go to 2.5, but you kind of want to be around 2. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking about how other economies are structured around their central bank and their financial abilities, with our treasury or their exchequer.
Cole, an interesting aside to that, when I started in the investment business in 1980, in the aftermath of Paul Volcker tightening credit intensely, we'd gather around the ticker tape machine, and on Thursday after the close, the money supply numbers would come out, and that's what the Fed was targeting, was money supply in those days, rather than
M2
M1 and M2, and oh gosh, people were paid a lot of money to decipher all that, and so just think of how the years go by. Now it's an interest rate based thing. It's not a money supply based thing. But I think you could probably do it by money supply. And boy, we exploded the money supply between the Trump administration and the Biden administration to fight the pandemic war. We probably exploded that money supply.
Take a look at a chart.
Yeah.
The other book I just got done reading is called Undelivered by a gentleman named Jeff Nussbaum. It's a bunch of speeches from, call it the 19th and 20th century, that obviously went undelivered. And so back to kind of Munger's inversion, you're now asking the question in an alternative history. And again, I think about it because a lot of what we do is the probabilities, okay? And when you can't know the future, you have to assign different probability, to different events, and they're kind of different paths in what could happen. And then there's obviously different odds based on those paths. And so Jeff's book has everything from Hillary's 2016 victory speech, which obviously went undelivered. He has in there JFK's invasion of attack of Cuba, which obviously never happened. We blockaded Cuba. And there's all these great, alternative histories.
What could have happened? Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me actually. Now, I think the danger in it is a lot of people will be like Uncle Rico. Okay. From obviously, I'm talking of Napoleon Dynamite fame, where he says things like, "Well, if Coach had only put me in fourth quarter, we would have won that game. We would have been state champs, and I'd be sitting here next to my soulmate.
I'd have gone pro,
Okay.
and I'd be sitting in a hot tub with my soulmate."
So I don't think it's valuable to sit there and be pissed at what's happened in life. I think it's more interesting to think about from today forward in the unknown future that we always have to deal with. What are the paths that we have to identify as possibilities and probabilities in outcomes, and that helps us understand risks and where we're likely to go as investors better. And by the way, Jeff is also, we're going to have a podcast with him that'll be releasing here in the fall, and I think just a wonderful discussion. We've already done some writing, in fact, off of Jeff's book. And then the last one that I also read, like Bill did, was The Economics of the Parables. Seamus, what have you read, or what are you working on?
So that one, you guys actually, I got that from both of you, and you guys were talking about it, so I went and got it, and it's a great book. I thought of it more in terms of parables being a way of keeping kind of mental models, so a way of describing something and the way you think things work and putting it in a story frame, and then being able to keep that in your head kind of for different scenarios. And so I like the idea of parables and relating to it, and just kind of how he talks about capitalism, entrepreneurship, what we do. It's never comfortable to do something that you don't know the future of, that you are putting risk in. I mean, obviously here we have all of our money in the fund, and we take risk with everybody. And he frames that and says that's really something to be valued, right? I mean, putting yourself out there, striving for something, even if you fail, that's something admirable. And capitalism and people starting businesses are not necessarily a negative thing, right? It's a positive thing to go out there and produce something for people, as long as you're not taking advantage of them.
In the parable of the talents, it actually makes me think, I walk away thinking, the parable of the talents is the parable of the stock picker, okay? Yeah. Because, and I don't want to steal too much from our discussion from him later, but he gave the most capital to the person he was the most confident of their skills. He gave the second most amount of capital, which was, he gave, was it 5, 3, and 1 talent away to the various individuals. But so the first person came back, got 5, came back with another 5, so he had 10. Second person gave 3, he came back with another 3. In other words, where he had the most confidence, he was right to actually place that capital with him, because the one he was the least confident on, he did what I'll call a starter position.
But 1 denarius, it was what the talent was. He explains was a tremendous amount of capital in those days. So the truth of it is, it'd be like Julian Robertson that passed away recently and funded the Tiger Cubs. He probably didn't give the same amount of money to each Tiger Cub, but he funded the Tiger Cubs, and it was the same way. The one I like in there that he pointed out, I'd never thought much about, was 2 people walked by and left the guy in the ditch. The Good Samaritan met the guy's needs, but then the last thing that Sirico talks about is he went to the innkeeper and said, any ongoing expense associated with this guy, you credit that to my account, and I will pay you the next time I come by the town.
And he said he probably was a businessman, because the amount of money that it took for them to do that was probably, he was traveling to do commerce or whatever.
I think we all overwhelmingly walked away of because I think he pushes back on this, the idea that Jesus was this little communist kind person, and he's telling stories that are very pro-capitalist, pro-business, things that you just don't tend to hear in certain religious circles at times. So let's pivot over to what we're currently reading. Bill, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I've broken into The Revolution That Wasn't by Spencer Jacob, I think is the way you pronounce his name. He's a writer for the Wall Street Journal. Has kids that are at the age that were part of the Robin Hood and Reddit thing, and by looking over his kids' shoulders, got extremely interested in the subject. And I'm early in the book, but it's already got Ken Griffin's Citadel and the founders and math geniuses. I mean, it's literally all the best ingredients of financial euphoria, and I'm only about 10 or 15% of the way into the book. So it's captured my imagination. And of course, we're reading The Knowing God by J.L. Packer, and That's like the methadone program coming off of C.S. Lewis's heroin.
I'm currently working on Fragile Futures by Vito Tanzi. And Vito, his book is written in the context of kind of a post-pandemic world. If we're going to have things like pandemics or earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, etc., he gives really good history tied to how that has taken various economic interests over time. For example, he talks about in the last 1,000 years there have been years without a summer, where we've had volcanic eruptions that have made the world colder and started off mini ice ages, which I think is a very interesting thing to think about. Now, here's the question I want to ask Vito, and this is my Charlie Munger higher seawalls answer, okay? So one of the things that Vito talks about is that volcanic eruptions do tend to change the weather very quickly. So if our current problem is too much warming tied to carbon, couldn't we just stick a couple nuclear warheads down into a volcano and get a lot of ash in the air to cool the earth? I mean, that's my capitalistic practice. I am a pragmatist. So that's something I want to ask Vito. I'm very excited for that.
And Cole's saying that, and a week before I graduated from college, Mount St. Helens blew up, and it definitely affected worldwide temperatures. That ash cloud reduced the temperatures around the world and is the biggest natural event of my lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's, let's see, that was May 18th of 80. Cole was born 3.5 years later. And I was sitting on the roof of the fraternity house at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was sunshiny. And I went, and it clouded up. I went downstairs to watch the Milwaukee Bucks and Supersonics play in the NBA playoff game, and they stopped the show to say that Mount St. Helens blew up. I went back up on the roof, and the street lights were on. The sun got eclipsed by the ash cloud.
If any of our listeners know Charlie Munger personally, I would say Munger thinks the carbon problem is going to be solved with just building higher seawalls. That's what his noted, economic argument is. I'm taking a more naturalist view that we just get to explode a volcano. So I hope that we can prove who's right, but I don't know if anyone's going to take my solution, pragmatically. Let's see, my other two books, Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli by Mark Seal. Mark Seal is writing this book as looking at Mario Puzo and Coppola and all the characters that got involved. Puzo's life is literally The Godfather. He had like the gun scene where, it's
Clemenza.
Clemenza's handing guns across, into the window to have his mother hide them. That happened to Mario Puzo as a child. And so I just think the Americana tied to it, the story of this, these immigrants, it's very interesting. And Bill, remind me the HBO, is it the HBO series that you're watching right now?
Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. It's called The Offer. It's the making of the Godfather movie, and it is spectacular.
Really spectacular. So Seal's book, it would be the book tied to that series. I think it's a very interesting read with the HBO show going on right now. The other one, and this was recommended to us by someone, which is How the World Really Works by Václav Smil. He comes at this from a very call it evolutionary theory. The world's been around for millions of years, and it's very interesting. Like, we had Mark Mills on the podcast, and Mark comes at it from more of a divine perspective, intelligent design, and gets to the same conclusion as Václav, which is very interesting, that two men with different, I'll call it personal beliefs and, in different ways of thinking how we got to here, but they get to the same natural law order of how the world is going to be sorted out. And so it'd be great to have Václav on if we had the chance. Seamus, what are you currently reading?
I actually just started. It was in our library, Systems Thinkers by Albert Rutherford, and it's kind of just small chapters on people in history and how they went about changing either their particular field or their industry. And it doesn't go too in depth, so it's actually a nice kind of quick read, but it gives you an idea of kind of people's thinking, what they did to change things.
Awesome. So lastly, any books that you've had recommended to you or ones that you've bought and are looking forward to cracking open.
You just got me excited about the 2 or 3 that you had on your list there that I haven't got to yet, Cole. I got to get to Nussbaum. That's a fascinating idea. The speeches that weren't delivered, because for each situation, the president of the United States has to have 2 bullets in his gun.
Well, and also you got to remember that the speech writers. This is to go back to that. The speech writers have to write 2 speeches and sometimes 3, based on what they decide. And it's interesting to think about. Jeff points this out, to be a speechwriter and completely disagree with something and yet have to write a convincing argument. It's like in our own work. What if you had to write the convincing argument to kill a company, right?
Yeah. Or if you're going to write the argument to justify paying way above average price earnings ratios for a mature growth company.
Yeah.
It's cool, too, because you have to keep 2 opposing kind of thoughts in your head. And that's
a good tension. So, Seamus, what are any books that you're either looking forward to or are going to read soon?
So this one I've seen out there quite a bit, Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. I don't know much about it. I know it gotten a lot of good reviews. It looks pretty good. And The Forgotten Man by Amity Shales.
Schlaze. Yeah, Schlaze. Yep. Yeah, we've had her on the podcast, so
it's not
I can verify that.
It's not a typo. Schlaze. Yeah. Great lady. That was
she was tons of fun to visit with. So the two that I have, let's see. In fact, I'll give our new colleague in London, Richard O'Connell, had passed me along a podcast done by a gentleman named Richard Oldfield, and he's a longtime money manager there in the UK. Had his own firm, now works for a larger firm. But his book that he published back in 2007 is called Simple But Not Easy. And he just republished kind of an updated edition of that. And listening to his podcast, I think I'm really excited for it because he points out, he tells a quick story where he says one time he had bought a first-class ticket on a train. And he's walking forward on the train, and he can't find his first-class seat. And right at the point when he was about to get the seat, he turns around and goes back to second class. And he says, as a stock picker and a value stock picker, that's what much of life's like, is when you should be finally getting your reward, you mistakenly turn around and go back to second class. So I'm very excited to read his book.
It sounds like a pretty good motto for our business. The 8 criteria we use and the way that we try to patiently wait for things to come to us. It's simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's tough to actually do. And then the other book that I've got, this is a very in liberal arts, multiple mental models. Shakespeare is as important to a classical education as any writer of the last 1,000 years. Robert McCrum has a book out called Shakespearean, which goes into a lot of the ideas across his books and him as a person. And so I'm excited to crack into that. That'll be a little thicker read, but I think will be really fun and refreshing.
Suffering some slings and arrows, sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. So Seamus, Bill, thanks for joining me for today. I'm really interested and excited about the books that we're going to read. I'm excited for the next few podcasts that we have with some of the authors that we talked about. For our listeners out there, again, we'll be doing this quarterly. This is the Smead book list. If you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeadcap.com. That's podcast@smeadcap.com. You can also get us on Twitter with a recommendation. Our handle is @SmeadCap. We'll look forward to the next time we do this on a Book with Legs podcast. We'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smead Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smead Capital Management and its products at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.